welcome everybody for tonight. My name is Catherine Rocchio. I'm chair of the Farm Pond Advisory Committee, and we're really excited and grateful, and thankful for having Hillary Kenyon presenting today. This is her third meeting. She first met with us 2 years ago, and then last year, and then this year. All of those prior meetings were recorded, and she's been working with us for the past 2 years via the support of the town. Please. And I will turn it over to Hillary to give us a presentation on her really the wrap up and final analysis of what she sees in the pond. So Hillary, I will give it to you.
Thank you. Okay, so can just in case I start talking a lot of details here, you can see my cursor, right? Possibly. Okay. And I think some people are nodding their heads. So, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for having me again. I'm really looking forward to talking to everybody about nutrient management and my overall recommendations for both in-lake and watershed-based management for Farm Pond. Some of the things I'm going to talk about are technical, so if you have questions, definitely type it into the chat and I will try my best to sort of keep an eye on that as I'm going along. If I don't get to a question, there's going to be an open QA session and discussion opportunity at the end. So everybody will be able to voice concerns or interests or questions. And I want this to be as open as a community involvement and discussion process as possible. Because this is the first time you're probably going to hear a lot of actual recommendations for management. So. Okay, so my presentation is outlined basically into two parts. The first part is all about nutrients. In-lake nutrients is what I'll start with, and discussing the data collected in 2023 and 2024, explain how that data collected was used in various modeling efforts to estimate internal loading or internal lake recycling of phosphorus. Um, Comparing those to past estimates that have been done, and then discussing some in-lake management actions that are possible and options for Farm Pond. I'm also going to briefly touch upon the role of sediment, particularly in cyanobacteria blooms, and talk about expectations if you were, as a community, to move forward with any recommendations you hear tonight. And then I'll move into the watershed-based section of the plan, detail the modeling effort from the watershed-based planning tool, some updated modeling that was done to sort of verify what happened in and what was done in the 2015 lake loading response model effort, and update it with more recent water quality data concentrations for calibrating that model. And then the second part of the presentation is relatively shorter, but there's been a lot of back and forth communications about aquatic plants and how relevant aquatic plant management is to overall lake management, even if you don't have any invasive plants at Farm Pond. So the contract with the town included a full lake aquatic plant survey in 2023. And so I'll just go over the results of that, talk about some general recommendations for aquatic invasive species management, or AIS, and then discuss projections for the future, and general topics related to eutrophication and plant change over time that you're probably going to see over the next couple decades. And then we can tie everything back together, talk about some ecological goals versus recreational goals, cost benefits for various types of management, and then ultimately everybody here is aware that it's sort of a moving target, and that as things change in the watershed, there's needs to be a consistent effort from the community in terms of just like manpower effort and also consistent funding to keep that ball from rolling downhill. So in the 2024 presentation, I was able to show you some of this, where I detailed the 2023 total phosphorus data. And now this is compared to both years side by side here. And again, what you're seeing is that these concentrations increase over time. And that yellow point here is corresponding to that deep water concentration. So you're seeing is a dramatic increase in total phosphorus, which is the primary plant and algae nutrient in freshwater bodies like Farm Pond, increasing over the course of the season, which occurs both years. and presumably annually in similar amounts over time. The increase in metalimnetic, or the middle of the water column nutrients, is less pronounced but still present. And then the surface concentrations are so low that it's actually difficult to see on this graph, which is a good thing because we want surface concentrations to be low for farm pond. But I'm going to switch this is still total phosphorus here on the left figure, but the scale is different and it's only visualizing the surface or the 1 meter depth concentrations, which is what we're considering the epilimnetic depth or depth. The um, horizontal dashed threshold lines, I think I talked about this in a previous presentation, but ultimately the goal for farm pond is to have as many of your concentrations in the surface waters below the 10 micrograms per liter of phosphorus threshold. That designates excellent water clarity, very low nutrients, oligotrophic conditions. As you get up into the 20 micrograms per liter concentrations, like what you saw in August of 2022, that can lead to very poor clarity, a potential increase in the risk of dense cyanobacteria blooms, and is definitely something that you don't want. This increase, although it is a doubling, is actually a very, very small amount of phosphorus, and the algae growth responds to it sort of exponentially over time. In the surface waters, we are also measuring compounds like total nitrogen. These thresholds for total nitrogen are similar to the thresholds for total phosphorus, but generally there's way more nitrogen in a system than phosphorus, which is why phosphorus tends to be that limiting phytoplankton nutrient. Um, Interestingly, the difference between the 23 and the 2024 spring surface total nitrogen was like fairly different. I'm going to say, because we don't have a lot of background nitrogen data, that this is pretty normal and that it's dependent upon um, how much watershed loading happened in the winter and how much rainfall you had either in the late winter into early spring period. But it also doesn't seem to be affecting the late season concentrations in nitrogen, which is good. All of these concentrations were slightly above the oligotrophic threshold for 200 micrograms per liter of total nitrogen, but it's still within the range of what I would consider pretty excellent water clarity or water quality. So this is where I might start to lose people, so definitely feel free to stop me if I need to. Um, as a recap, the internal phosphorus load is the annually recycled amount of phosphorus from the deep water sediments. This happens every year when there is a loss of dissolved oxygen at the bottom, which is a fairly natural phenomenon. And it just means that it changes the water chemistry that allows the type of phosphorus that's accumulated from years and years and years of watershed loading in the sediments at the bottom of the lake to then be partially resuspended and dissolved into the water column. Some of that phosphorus is going to disproportionately affect cyanobacteria growth, which really like to use deep water nutrients to proliferate in the season, particularly later in the season. So to estimate internal phosphorus load, which previously was assumed to be negligible for farm pond, but clearly was not the case. The first method, well, there's many ways to do this. The first method that was used for farm pond modeling was an aerial release rate over time. So that's given the sediment phosphorus data and literature values for the amount of phosphorus released over a weekly, monthly, summer-based time period over a specific area of exposed anoxic sediment. And then the second method, I'm going to elaborate on that in the next slide. And then the second method is to verify the first estimate by actually using in-lake phosphorus concentration and then extrapolating that out over the volume of water to come up with a mass estimate as an increase throughout the course of the season. I'll show you that. So this is an explanation that's more detailed in the report of how the anoxic boundary defines the model for internal load. So this is directly using your dissolved oxygen profiles. In 2020 through 2022, it was just the Farm Pond Advisory Committee profiles, and then in 2023 and 2024, it was the AWS profiles. So when you have anoxia start to develop at the bottom of the lake, if you can see my cursor here, over time throughout the season, it's going to push up and there's going to be a greater surface area of exposed sediment that is capable of releasing phosphorus. If anoxia is worse in any given year, then you have a proportionally larger sediment area that will release phosphorus during anaerobic conditions. And so something that should jump out to you is this is the modeled based on the hypsographic curve here of the surface area based on depth from your bathymetry map. Um, and 2022, in the August and September time periods, you had a huge increase in the surface area of potentially exposed anoxic sediment, which would dramatically increase the potential for internal loading and the amount of phosphorus released, which I believe is one of the issues and reasons behind having that bad, persistent, full lake-wide bloom with very poor clarity in 2022. Ultimately, on average, it was estimated through this method about 24 kilograms annually. Um, the second method uses those inlet concentrations where, like I said earlier, you're using the actual milligram or micrograms per liter of phosphorus and then multiplying that by the volume of the water of the sample of the layer of water that it was collected at. And so this is a way to verify the initial estimate. And ultimately, these came back a little bit lower, and the overall load was about 25% um, of the total annual for internal load, which is fairly high. Generally, lakes with a average of greater than 20% internal load warrants some type of internal loading control methods. And it reduces the fact that even if you were to control all watershed inputs to the lake, there's probably still going to be an issue with nutrients, and internal loading could potentially still fuel cyanobacteria blooms despite controlling any nutrients coming from the watershed. Um, so that's just something to be aware of and justifying in lake management in general. When I went back to look at the 2022 bloom data from total phosphorus surface values that were collected before the bloom in 22 and then during the bloom, there's actually a 45 kilogram epilimnetic or surface water layer increase in phosphorus based on those concentrations from 2022, which shows that that 25% might be an average where most of the time you don't see the effects and you most of the time are able to maintain really good water clarity and excellent surface nutrient conditions and low phytoplankton. But in cases where the anoxia is worse, and then if there's a heavy wind mixing event that entrains more of it up into the surface, that could be potentially upwards of 44%. And so people should, despite the fact that we assign a specific percentage for planning purposes, it is a dynamic system that changes annually, and it's important to understand that it's not a static estimate. One of the things that uh, should also be considered is the fact that the internal load tends to be more bioavailable, so it's in a form that's directly usable to cyanobacteria or other types of phytoplankton algae. Whereas a lot of the watershed inputs are in particulate forms and have to go through some amount of settling or decomposition or anaerobic release of the iron-bound phosphorus to actually fuel cyanobacteria. So that takes longer and it isn't immediate effects. Another thing to consider is that climate change is worsening cyanobacteria blooms and simultaneously increasing anoxia in lakes because it's making the stratification longer throughout the growing season and stronger. And so it is likely that this load, internal load, could get worse over time. Um, I didn't set a timer, so I don't know how long I'm going at the moment. So I'm gonna try to go over everything. But if I am going too much into detail, I'll try to skip through it. I actually took out a couple of these slides that detailed different methods with like visuals because I didn't want to take too much time explaining it because there's a lot of available detail in the report itself, and then also with the publications that are out there from Mass DCR, including the updated 2025 Guide to Lake Management from the state. But aeration, oxygenation, hypolimitic withdrawal, and phosphorus binding treatments are pretty much the only acceptable options for controlling internal phosphorus load. Aeration has a really, really low chance of success, and it also has, particularly for farm pond, the risk of making it way worse. There are plenty of case studies where aeration systems, which induce artificial circulation and erode the thermocline, um, potentially mix high concentrations of nutrients from the bottom water to the surface waters as an unintended consequence. So we're not doing that. Oxygenation, on the other hand, uses 100% oxygen, which has a really high chance of reducing the internal load and maintaining good oxygen conditions with added habitat benefits over time. But it's very costly and might not be logistically feasible for farm pond. And potentially, based on the fact that you only have occasional cyanobacteria blooms, not really worth the cost. Hypolimitic withdrawal is a process where you take deep water, high nutrient um, water and pump it out of the lake, out through the outlet. But it potentially causes downstream water quality issues. And I don't know any systems in Massachusetts that's actively permitted right now. It was more common in like the 80s time period. And that leaves us basically with phosphorus binding treatments, which are the primary mechanism for most case studies in Massachusetts that have had trouble with internal phosphorus loading fueling cyanobacteria blooms. There are lots of different minerals that bind phosphorus, but it's really only lanthanum and aluminum that consistently bind stable phosphate and are not subjected to anaerobic dissolution. So the most common type of alum treatment is the aluminum sulfate treatment using a buffering solution of sodium aluminate to maintain a stable pH. One of the reasons why alum treatments are very closely regulated is because if they're not buffering the pH, there could potentially be a fish kill if the pH is not stable. And so during any potential alum treatment, there's a lot of planning that goes into it. And behind the actual treatment boat, you're doing continuous monitoring of pH and then adjusting the ratios of product that's applied appropriately. Um, you can also apply polyaluminum chloride, which the primary benefit of that is that you're not adding extra sulfate to the lake. Lanthanum, I can go into in more detail, but ultimately, alum is used as a flocculant. So you can apply it to the lake to clear the water column of particulates. They will settle to the bottom and it reacts to form aluminum hydroxide, which forms a very stable phosphorus mineral when it binds to available phosphate, effectively creating a cap on the surface. It's important to understand that success of any type of treatment, lanthanum or alum, is dose dependent and application method dependent. So the higher amount of product that is used, generally you see better success. And I have a full slide detailing the estimate that I came up with for Farm Pond. Lanthanum is probably not something that most people have heard of yet because it's not readily permitted in Massachusetts. But the 2025 update to the Massachusetts Guide for Lake Management has included lanthanum modified bentonite, which is like bentonite is a clay mineral. And basically, it's a laboratory process to replace the existing bentonite ions with the lanthanum, and that binds to a very stable lanthanum phosphate mineral, which is actually more stable over time and reportedly a better and higher binding efficiency than alum, but it is more costly. The primary benefit of lanthanum is that it's also pH stable and doesn't require, because it's a clay, the pH monitoring and management but it's also not a flocculant. And so if you had available phosphorus or phytoplankton in the water column, it's not going to take any of that out of the water column. It's going to leave it, and it's basically going to look like a brown cloud if it was applied until it settled to the lake bottom, forming a similar cap on the sediment surface. There are other forms of lanthanum-based products that are proprietary, and I don't know if they're going to be at all used in Massachusetts at this time, but it's something just to be aware of, is that Utrisorb WC formulation is probably a lanthanum hydroxide binder, but it is proprietary, so I'm just assuming that's what it is, which would be a similar flocculant to alum. The trade names for the lanthanum modified bentonite product that is going to be permitted in Massachusetts are either Foslock or Utrisorb G. The 2023 sediment results these are averages shown here, are what was used to calculate potential strategies for alum dosing in the lake. Ultimately, it's the loosely sorbed phosphorus, the iron-bound phosphorus, and sometimes the label organic phosphorus that can be potentially available to the internal road. The reductant soluble is what the majority of large lake treatments for alum are based on. And this basically is just a sequential fractionation using different extracting solutions that together add up to about the total of 2133 milligrams per kilogram of phosphorus in the sediments in the deep water areas. So I am going to be clear that I'm not immediately recommending this for farm pond, but I've done the legwork and it is a potential option for the future should cyanobacteria blooms become more common. And it's worth exploring options in this case. So a full sediment locking dose is probably going to run in the range of $370,000 for about a 50-acre treatment. And in terms of cost, it seems high, but when you compare it to an oxygenation system with an oxygenation system, probably initial capital investment of close to 700,000 plus, with annual maintenance operation costs for any oxygenation system most likely exceeding $30,000 a year. So it's expensive to fully control internal load, but you don't necessarily need to control all of it. This would be a 147 grams of aluminum per meter squared estimated dosage based on the sediment concentrations, um, and a aluminum to phosphorus binding ratio that I've recommended of about 12, which is supported by other treatments that have been done in Mass over the last 20 years, 20 plus years, and also in literature case studies from New England and other places in the US and abroad. But as I said, it's not going to be done all at once. It would definitely have to happen in stages. So that brings me to what my actual recommendation is if cyanobacteria blooms become worse and you start to see a potential for blooms like what you saw in 2022 becoming more common, I would recommend doing partial sediment doses, which is a combination of water column stripping, so you're getting the flocculation action, and then also eventually building up to that full sediment cap dosage. It's a strategy that has been used in cases where um, you are not, like in the case of farm pond, most of the time you have excellent water clarity. You're just trying to keep it that way. You're not up against the scenario where you have persistent cyanobacteria blooms for weeks on end, months on end throughout the summer, which in those cases, sometimes communities can justify doing the full treatment all at once or in 1 year or in 2 years. But because that's not the case for farm pond, it makes more sense to stretch it out over a period of time and do it as sort of like maintenance type of treatments. Um, I recommend that if you go this route, that you do injection into the metalymnion and trying to include a larger surface area than just maybe the 50 acres. One of the things that should be considered for any type of internal loading control is the fact that it can only control cyanobacteria for some types of blooms. So when you have a what I call a pop-up bloom, where cyanobacteria come usually earlier in the season, and you see a small, maybe 1 or 2 foot wide surface scum accumulation on shore, that might still happen after an alum treatment. An alum treatment is used to prevent prolonged cyanobacteria blooms. You can't eliminate cyanobacteria from farm pond completely. That's just not going to be possible. And I included these diagrams to sort of explain how some types of cyanobacteria start growing on the sediment surface and will get a lot of their nutrients for the initial bloom period from shallow or moderate depth sediments. Excuse me. And so what you're seeing here in early spring usually is a pop-up bloom where you don't have that much growth yet, but if the nutrients were high in the water column, it would sustain itself for a longer period of time. But because that's not the case most of the time at farm pond, usually your scums don't last for longer than like a day or two, and can be dissipated fairly quickly. The factors associated with those small pop-up blooms are usually either a combination of temperature, physical resuspension, light. There's papers that say one is more important than the other, but if you look at the large literature reviews, it's sort of a combination of others and like everything all together, and that it's not necessarily consistent from one lake to another or one type of cyanobacteria to another because they're also evolutionarily different. So in terms of managing expectations, I just wanted to be clear that if you were to pursue any in-lake management of phosphorus with an alum treatment, that you might still have some occasional small and short-lived cyanobacteria blooms. Really, what alum is good for is controlling those really persistent full lake events where you have completely reduced clarity for an extended period of time. Okay, so if there, I don't see any questions in the chat, so I'm gonna move on to the watershed-based section and management recommendations and modeling efforts for watershed. In the earlier presentations, I talked about how watershed loading affects internal loading, and part of that is because the mass that accumulates in the bottom is also a result of settling of particulate matter from the watersheds and surface waters throughout the course of the stratified season in summer. Um, so in some cases, reducing the watershed load actually reduces deep water concentrations to some extent as well. The Massachusetts Watershed-Based Planning Tool is a model that Massachusetts has graced. It was originally developed by Geosyntech, and if you go on the website, it's basically a standardized way to model all water bodies for phosphorus and nitrogen and total suspended solids. Um, and in terms of the output, it is more general, so I had to do a lot of follow-up modeling to sort of verify what the model was saying and make sure it made sense and was calibrated to the water quality we were seeing in farm pond. One of the outputs of the model is the estimated impervious area, which is actually only 3% of your watershed. So a lot of water bodies have 20+% of impervious area. Urban water bodies could have over 50% impervious area in some cases. Very good water quality typically needs less than 10%. And in terms of management, the major goal is to disconnect any directly connected surface area of impervious cover. So this road here has culverts that go directly to the lake from those catch basins. This is the parking lot to the Sherborn boat ramp, and this is considered a directly connected impervious area. The deviating of stormwater, which is there's several recommendations in the plan itself for structural improvements to reduce runoff. Um, that disconnects impervious cover and infiltrates it higher up in the watershed, which then naturally allows the soils to treat the phosphorus and nitrogen. Ultimately, there's a lot of there's a lot of private property in the watershed. And so reducing impervious area is going to be up to individual homeowners in a lot of cases. The town has their area that they're able to manage. But what happens in terms of runoff on your own properties is really important lake-wide, and keeping a buffer zone from your house to the shoreline is one of the best ways to prevent erosion and to prevent the runoff directly into the lake. Ultimately, the model showed that all impervious cover really only counted for 10% of the annual P load, but is still an important component to move forward with management. This output model from the watershed-based planning tool was like dramatically higher than the original estimate from the 2015 lake loading response model from um, the consultant that was hired at that time through the town of Sherborn. I went back and recreated the 2015 model and updated the calibration based on spring average phosphorus concentrations. So that 2015 model, what I found was that it was actually calibrated to a mean of 8 micrograms per liter of phosphorus, which is considerably lower than what the spring mixed conditions of phosphorus are. So even going back and redoing the lake loading response model, I found that it was more aligned with the output of the watershed-based planning tool, and then ultimately the total overall load to Farm Pond is about 77 kilograms, and that's detailed here. Um, If you see here, geese is about 12% of the total, so it's definitely something that's going to need to be managed in the future, primarily with improved deterrence. So the boat ramp area has those moorings out, and the amount of goose poop on all of those boats is like beyond gross. And if possible, I don't know what the process is for people cleaning those at this point. But if you're able to take it to shore and clean it on shore instead of just brushing it off into the water, that still would be beneficial because 12% of the annual total load is like a lot for waterfowl and for geese poop. And the primary reason for that is that you have over like 115 resident geese at the lake that I counted on multiple occasions. It's just a very large population. At some point, we can talk in more detail about if you want to move forward with any kind of egg addling permits or hunting to reduce the geese population over time. I don't know if the town has been active in trying to reduce the geese population at all, but it is a potential ongoing source of nutrients, particularly if they travel to a site and then come back to Farm Pond. Another major portion of the external phosphorus load is from septic systems and general wastewater. So I did a estimate of actually in-lake urination by swimmers and kids. In most cases, it's probably not a substantial amount for phosphorus in like eutrophic water bodies, but there's heavy use of the swim area and Sherborn Yacht Club. And because you have such low concentrations, the 1.6 pounds of phosphorus in that case is still a lot to be adding. So in the plan itself, I recommended some general ways to potentially discourage that kind of behavior, which I believe is already discouraged. Um, but ultimately, I think if people understood the possible link between these filamentous algae clouds and possibly stagnant areas with high nutrient inputs from maybe kids peeing in the water during summer camp, they might think twice about it. There's also a lot of nitrogen that's put in through wastewater as well. Ultimately, the load was very similar to what was estimated in 2015, and you guys should be glad that the Mass Title V regulations provide such good protection for groundwater. It's some of the best in the country. And attenuation of phosphorus in groundwater in Massachusetts, because you have a high separation distance to the groundwater table and to the impervious area of soils, usually you get greater than 90% control, which is awesome. Okay, so this is part two. The aquatic plant survey, um, I have some photos that I can show you guys to look at those aquatic plants. I'm going to come back to the slide actually. So the most dominant species observed of aquatic macrophytes was Nitella, similar to what was seen in 2015, and I believe the other survey initially was like 2013 or 2014. And Nitella is not actually a true aquatic plant. It is a macroalgae that tends to grow in deeper water areas. And in the case of slowly increasing eutrophication over time, I tend to see Nitella in oligotrophic lakes, and it gets denser over time and serves as a precursor to rooted aquatic plants in deeper water. Um, Most of the shoreline area is fairly gravelly, and you have low nutrients and low organic matter around the shoreline from the like 0 to 4 foot depth range to actually grow submerged aquatic plants. Over time, as more organic matter settles in these areas, you will start to see more native plant growth over time. Another dominant plant was needle spike rush or Eleochris, most commonly Eleochris acicularis, and this is one that's mostly in water shallower than 4 feet and provides like a carpeting cover. And this is actually a really good plant, despite the fact that sometimes it can become dislodged and potentially cause these like floating mats of what you were describing as grass clippings. Um, it does secure the sediment in a lot of ways to prevent resuspension of sediment in areas based on wind action. So that's a good thing to have over time. Other common species were Isoedes or quillwort, fontinalis, which was most common in areas that had overhanging trees and that were shaded, and gravelly because it gets a lot of its nutrients from the water column as opposed to just rooted nutrients from the sediments. And then Sagittaria gramineae was the other more common species, which you see often in situations like this where it'll be mixed into those carpets in the shallow 0 to 4 foot depth range. Other uncommon species were native Myriophyllum humuli, or a low water milfoil, pipewort, narrow-leaf pondweeds, and then yellow water lily. There were a couple other species there as well. They're all detailed in the report. The only invasive plant that was seen during the 2023 survey was purple loosestrife, and that was a shoreline wetland plant in one location that you guys are aware of. And in 2024, the volunteers reported finding, I believe, 2 water chestnut plants in the swim area that were hand removed, thankfully. Water chestnut is one of those species that can be transported easily by birds, often great blue herons, and I've seen it pop up in places, but if you catch it early, is easily eradicated. Um, so in general, aquatic plant management is mostly about prevention, but also about catching things early. So this is a copy of the invasion curve from the Adirondack Almanac, but this has been used all over the place. If you do annual or biannual aquatic plant surveys and you become more familiar with what plants are existing where in the lake over time, you have a higher chance of finding something in the period of time where it's a considered easily prevented or eradicated detection. If you wait even just 2 years for some types of invasive species before a new infestation is found, it becomes like ultimately unmanageable. And the costs associated with managing something like hydrilla or Eurasian milfoil or curly-leaf pondweed or variable milfoil or in some cases water chestnut, like your $60,000 a year is like pretty normal. And you don't want to be at that case because that's normal to keep it like swimmable, let alone managing for habitat. And because you have very, very clear water, it's possible for these invasive plants, like particularly Eurasian milfoil and hydrilla, to grow really deep in the water column, like up to 18 or 20 feet deep to grow all the way to the surface. Um, and so prevention is your number one priority in this case. And then your second priority is to detect any potential new infestations as fast as possible and to manage them appropriately. I touched on some of these points already, but generally, you over time are going to start to see more aquatic plants in the lake, including native species, as the lake becomes more eutrophic or mesotrophic over time. Generally, if you start to see large leaf species of Potamogeton, like large leaf pondweed or amplifolius is the species, or Richardsonii. There's a lot of different species of native pondweeds that can grow to the point where they become a nuisance. There's oligotrophic water bodies in Connecticut that annually remove these species because they've grown to the point where it's obstructing swim areas and spreading and covering the entire lake. So native plant management is something to be aware of, particularly in places like Farm Pond where you have ample area and water um, clarity with like light to grow really, really deep into the water column and cover more of your surface area of the littoral zone. So overall, um, there's a lot in this plan that's going to be released to the public fairly shortly. But I wanted to hear some of your initial like takeaways from this presentation and sort of modify my ultimate recommendations for how to proceed with either managing in-lake um, via alum treatments and internal load control, or if you want to proceed with getting permits for things like cyanobacteria peroxide use, which is sort of a last minute band-aid approach to killing cyanobacteria to keep recreational areas open in the absence of an alum treatment or other type of phosphorus binding option. Um, I see Melinda has a comment up, so give me a second. And then ultimately, there's a lot of recommendations in the plan itself about prioritizing certain areas of the watershed for reducing stormwater runoff, and then prioritizing ways to increase public involvement and incentivize improving local shoreline properties as well. Um, Melinda, go for it.
Awesome, thanks. So as always, Hillary, thank you, thank you, thank you. Your presentations are positively amazing. Um, so question for you about the cyanobacteria blooms. How do we know, like, what is the threshold? Like, how do we balance between, oh, there's a few blooms, we can live with that, versus, uh-oh, we better start considering the treatment?
So I think you are perpetually at risk of having pretty substantial cyanobacteria blooms because your concentrations of deep water nutrients are so high. You're, in most cases in late summer, one large windstorm away from a potential bloom that is rivaling what you saw in 2022. It's whether or not it actually happens. In cases like in 2022, I looked back at the profile data and the phosphorus data at that time, compared it to the updated information. And what I believe happened was there was a period of time where um, stratification was stronger than normal because you had really, really hot weather, and you had a subsequent increase in the area of anoxic zone and increase in internal loading. So you had below the thermocline potentially more phosphorus than usual. And then if you have a subsequent high wind time period, that can potentially disrupt the thermocline or erode part of the thermocline, or even just create a lot of wave action in the thermocline area. You can entrain more of that bottom water nutrients into the surface waters. There's also the fact that um, some types of cyanobacteria, which I've talked about before, grow directly at the thermocline before coming to the surface. And I didn't see it in 2023 and 2024. The dominant phytoplankton at the anoxic boundary was actually a serratium, not a cyanobacteria, which was really interesting to see. But I've done some literature reviews back and forth, and Microcystis, which is a cyanobacteria, sometimes has a back and forth relationship with serratium at that depth as well. So I do think that you should move forward with some type of internal load control in the future. Um, you could probably get away with not doing it for a while, but you're always going to run the risk of having a potential large event like you did in 2022. All right, I see some chat. Okay, someone's saying it'd be helpful if you offer thoughts on chances of swim season canceling versus brief periods of restriction events. Yeah, so um if the water is generally clear and there are no scums present, the risk of cyanotoxin exposure is low. And the public health guidelines are extremely conservative and based on visual assessments primarily. And the EPA recreational guidelines based on toxin exposure, most cases would have very low risk for um, people in swim areas, even in the light scums that I saw over the last 2 years. I hesitate to say that, but it is true. um, and uh, I can put a link to the full document for the EPA recreational contact advisory, but it's really the little kids and the dogs that are most at risk for exposure. Um, Cyanobacteria are more likely to harm people and dogs that swallow the water, as opposed to people who are just swimming in it. Um,
Hillary, that was my question and Craig's sermon. I think going to a town-wide town meeting and saying we have to do this phosphorus treatment, people are going to want to understand why. And we don't have crystal balls. Events will happen over time. But if there's anything like, yeah, you guys can't swim in this pond unless we do this on this kind of timeline, um, I think that would be very motivating. And I think it would take that kind of motivation to take townwide action. So other people may have different opinions about that. But I wondered if there's any science to, frequency of small events happening. Or yes, there's extreme situations that can happen with winds that'll, shut us down for days where people aren't comfortable swimming. But if we were able to say, no, this is no longer a swimming lake, and we can project that out if we don't act now. I mean, that would be very valuable. You have any thoughts on that?
yeah, so I have worked on many water bodies that are closed for months for
Right,
cyanobacteria blooms.
right.
And I don't think Farm Pond is anywhere near that right now, but the bloom that you saw in 2022 persisted for several weeks. And so that shows
Right.
me that it's possible.
So would we know when we're closer to that? And how would we know if we're closer to that?
Yeah, so I've put some recommendations for increased monitoring into the plan itself, primarily detailing ways that you can use the existing phycocyanin volunteer monitoring program to collect deep water samples and predict situations where the bloom might be forming at depth and then coming to the surface. So that's one way. And then another way that you could potentially predict it is by being aware of higher than usual anoxic conditions and weather patterns that might present a risk of cyanobacteria blooms that were worse than usual.
Can I just ask as a one follow-up, what's it taken for towns to act historically? Is it 2 years in a row of a shutdown? Is it just one very vocal subgroup that says, look, we don't want to deal with these small ones? What tends to make it a tipping point?
Um, it really depends on the community. I find that water communities where people are used to having really clear, excellent water clarity, they actually act faster because they realize how bad it can get.
Yeah,
And they want to
yeah.
maintain good water quality. In situations where people have grown up going and recreating on a lake that's like already mesotrophic, borderline eutrophic, and it's just gotten worse over the 20 years that they've been on the lake, they're kind of like, it'll be fine next week. It's a sort of community perception that drives those changes. And some people in situations are more concerned about it than others.
Yeah.
People who have small pets and small children that want to be swimming actively and probably ingesting more water than the normal human, those are definitely the high risk cases.
Thanks so much. Wonderful, wonderful work.
I see another in the chat. Marianne's asking if low dose alum treatments were used for 5 to 10 consecutive years, when approximately would this need to be repeated for another 5 to 10 years? So, I haven't done that full calculation, but generally that dosage that for the full sediment 147 um, grams of aluminum per meter squared application rate, that could give you 20 years of control once you've reached that amount. The internal recycling is driven by decades and decades of settled particulates, and it's deeper lakes like Farm Pond that have smaller watersheds that tend to respond longer and better to internal loading controls than watersheds that are larger with like a shallower lake with higher flushing rates.
Thank you. Just quickly, when's the season? What season of the year are these alum doses typically given?
Spring,
Spring.
probably late spring.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
Thank you.
and to be honest, I think that's more a factor, excuse me, of trying to prevent the that season from getting worse and keeping it in the sediments at that time. Because in the spring, most of the nutrients from the internal load are actually still in the sediments. They haven't started coming out of the sediment yet.
Mhm, mhm.
Um, can we argue that starting sooner with alum treatments will be a lower cost over time? Can you estimate the roughly annual cost of gradual treatments? Yeah, so that is true. The increasing cost right now of aluminum-based products probably is going to go up over time. So there is, like, with inflation and just general increase of costs of services and products over time, that is a factor, yes. Um, there's also the fact that in doing gradual treatments, you're also going to pay for more, like I don't wanna say deployment costs of having the treatment applicator come there multiple times, which if you were doing a higher amount in smaller or a higher amount in fewer treatments, you might run lower costs for labor personnel. Um, so yes, there's definitely pros and cons of both. I think ultimately you don't want to be in a situation where you apply it all at once because um, lakes respond differently to alum treatments, and allowing lower dose treatments over time, you have the flexibility to adjust your dose as you need and how the lake responds. So I think there's utility and value in doing it over time. A lot of recommendations that I've come up with for alum treatments are at least a 3-year plan to go up to a full sediment dose. Um, Sophie, does Sophie have a question?
I do, but other people have their hand raised, so I
Okay.
allow other people also if.
Okay. Steph.
Okay, great, thanks. You noted in your presentation that the land around Farm Pond is mostly privately owned. You mentioned that the report includes some strategies around property management, best practices. Have you included in the report, or do you have examples of or access to examples of like policy strategies where privately owned land can be managed using the sort of like best practices that you're outlining in the report?
Yes, it outlines general best practices, but in terms of policy, are you talking about like public-private partnerships for management or just private?
Well, like any strategies. So like public-private partnerships, the potential for like, a zoning bylaw that could,
Yeah.
help with private strategies. I guess we're just, I'm interested in any towns that you're aware of that may have been successful on a policy front.
Yes, zoning and increasing upland review areas is like one of the most common ways to minimize harmful development that could potentially happen in areas. Another thing that I've seen in watersheds is in the public-private partnership sphere. Sometimes private property can be used to infiltrate stormwater that's generated from public property in easements, and like there's definitely opportunities there as well. Tom?
Hillary, thank you so much. Really learned a lot. And can I put you on the spot? There was one of your graphs that really jumped out. The one where you plotted anoxic area for the 5
Mhm.
years. And while you're getting to that, thank you also for the 2 years that you've stuck with us. That's the one. And I know drove up from Connecticut 7 or 8 times every year for 2 years. That was a lot of a lot of driving, having done it myself. The 2022 year, that was the really difficult year where August, September, October, we got down to less than 3 feet of transparency. And I think you nailed it out of the park here. This comparison over 50 acres, the pond is 126 acres. So like 40% of the pond was anoxic versus the other years where we saw much less in the way of blooms. Uh, One thing you probably remember, that was one of our bigger drought years in the last 5 years. And we're having a series of these droughts every 2 or 3 years. What kind of role do you think drought has in some of these patterns?
Drought makes the internal load more significant because usually the drought is later in the season, and that's when the internal load is most sustained.
And one follow-up, given that this coming season, well, we're in it already, and we've already had a bloom. We're coming off a 2024-25 drought. Do you think we're at particularly risk with the low water level right now for continuing blooms?
Um, it's not necessarily the low water level that makes you more of a risk. It's that there's no flushing later in the season, and so that the only nutrient inputs that you're getting are bad quality from the internal load later in the season. So I can't say for certain. There's some lakes that respond better to higher rainfall later in the season because it tends to be a lower amount of nutrients from rainfall. Granted, atmospheric deposition is also high for farm pond relatively, but the concentrations in rainwater are generally lower than concentrations in coming from sediments.
Thank you.
And Michael? Oh, you're muted.
Thank you. Hi, thanks for a great presentation. I guess I have a few questions, but if you can go to the table that shows the total loading and we're at the different sources. But I'll also, in the meanwhile, ask if you find that doing the alum is sort of like at a minimum, you do a 3-year kind of program that makes sense. That would teach us a lot about how the pond responds, as well as if we decided not to continue it for various reasons, it's not a loss of effort. It's still something that has a benefit that goes on for quite a while. Is that
Yes.
so? Okay, so I guess does the report show a little bit of what it might mean for the cost of a sort of that kind of 3? Okay.
Yeah. It's hard to predict it because I don't know how quickly you're going to do, and the costs generally increase, like you said, over time with just general costs of material increasing annually. But yes, there are some options laid out and potential costs associated with various options.
Okay. And so looking at the let's see, the internal, I was looking at this, the internal load is okay, using the 20, although I guess it was more than that, in some other tables.
It was,
Um,
I had estimated it to be 20 overall,
Yeah.
which is on average, and that is considerably lower than what happened in 2022.
all right. The watershed and natural runoff.
Yeah, so something I didn't talk about is
Yeah.
interesting. So this is from the watershed-based planning output tool here. I replicated that in the updated 2020 updated lake loading response model and did a run through of if the entire watershed was forested, what the output would be, and estimated that like roughly only I think it was only 10%, 7.5 kilograms of runoff was from anthropogenic developed lands as opposed to natural background sources of phosphorus.
Is there any way of managing that natural runoff, or is that just?
Sort of.
Yeah.
There's cases where you can increase the storage capacity of wetlands, and like routing streams to be less channelized and to have more contact with plants as they move through a wetland area. But that usually is not a preferred option for non-point source pollution in most cases.
Okay, so it's just a matter of the natural is coming more from surface water issues than any sort of, so basically it's the goal of just getting everything into the ground, which hopefully if it goes through some sort of growing plant layer, then some of the phosphorus reduced, but if it just goes through into the ground without any of that, then it'll just end up in the pond anyway, even if it's.
So yeah, so there's differences in phosphorus and nitrogen attenuation based on the technologies of stormwater runoff. A constructed wetland or a natural wetland is better at uptaking nitrogen because there's a lot of plant growth, whereas phosphorus is better attenuated through infiltration because soils are really good at binding phosphorus.
Oh, right, okay. And for other people go, there's that little swampy marshy area, which is where one of the outlets basically is the outlet for Farm Pond.
Mm-hmm.
Do you, I guess I'm curious what you see as that as a source of a problem, or just it's there, or not much about, not to be too concerned about since it's really down water, so to speak, or
Well,
downstream.
so over the berm you're talking about at the
Yeah,
outlet?
exactly.
Yeah, so I see the threat to that being that over time, if it erodes, there's definitely higher nutrients in that outlet pond than there is in farm pond. And so if there's backflow situation, because it's pretty much without the berm, the same water elevation as farm pond, that would definitely be a nutrient source. So maintaining the integrity of the berm I see as important.
Is there really much of a chance of a backflow?
Um,
Given the way,
yeah, yeah, there is.
what could cause a backflow?
Just if so at this point in time, um, the water flows basically over the berm until the water level of farm pond is so low that it no longer flows over the berm. So you have like basically no surface water outflow for most of the season from farm pond. Um, if you have the backflow is basically going to be not visible. It's going to be the same water elevation if the berm were not there. Where slowly, yes, everything will still be moving towards the outlet, but it's going to be mixing in the process of doing so, if that makes sense.
Not fully, but I'll let other people talk. Thank you.
Sophie?
Hi, thank you, Hillary. It's great to hear everything you've researched. I actually have seen a backflow from that swampy area into the pond. It was last winter when the swampy area's outlet was plugged by beavers for a long time, and the water was the same on both sides, but went over the berm. So there was a period of time where the water from the swampy area mixed with the pond, and then the water went back down. So, but I saw it happened. It was not this winter, but the winter before. I'm a little curious. We lived here on the pond for 19 years. I've never seen anything like what's happened now. Like on May 16, I went kayaking and the cyanobacteria bloom. It was the size of an Olympic pool. It wasn't just scum on the surface. It was the water was bright blue and it was incredibly smelly. And up to now the clarity is really bad. And yesterday there was a smell that came into our home. I've never had that happen from the water. So I think we're in the midst of a really bad bloom that's not going away fast. And I just wanted to share my observations and wonder, on that day that the water quality was really bad, some people were swimming. And I was like, anyway, I'm concerned that it's happening now and you're not here, Hillary. So
does anybody have an open water water clarity value from that time or no? No. So like in order for me to say whether or not it's a lake-wide event or like just a surface accumulation, I would use the open water clarity to sort of decide that. Because if open water clarity was still fairly good, like greater than 4 meters, and you were still seeing really high shoreline scums, that tells me that it's probably not going to continue. Whereas if clarity was like 1 meter or 2 meters in open water, potentially the nutrients are high enough that it could potentially continue for weeks on end, even in spring.
I can only offer my untrained eye, but to me, it looks like 2022 all over again, but I don't have ways to measure, so I don't want to be an alarmist. I'm just saying this is what I'm seeing, and I wanted to share my observations.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Thanks.
Daryl?
Mentioned something like a potential 20-year effectiveness time period for the alum, but are there limits to the use of alum or lanthanum or chlorides or sulfates being applied because at some point it would interfere with other dynamics, natural dynamics, aquatic life, that kind of thing?
Yeah. So the EPA uses water quality data to determine what their maximum in-lake concentration of aluminum and lanthanum are. And so any permit that would be like any permit application would have to come up with an in-lake schedule of treatment that would attain those in-lake acute concentrations set by the EPA. And it has to do with, it's different for every water body based on your water hardness and your dissolved organic content.
Do you think the EPA numbers are good, solid numbers to rely on in terms of any impacts?
It's based on acute toxicity testing for things like zooplankton and fish fry and invertebrates. So it does have a substantial amount of research behind it. One thing that doesn't have a good estimate of adding additional sulfate to the lake, in situations where copper sulfate has been added for years and years and years to treat algae, there are some situations where they're not actually binding phosphorus, but the sulfate could potentially bind with iron, which then makes the sediments less able to hold the phosphorus because it forms iron sulfide minerals, which I know that that's already happening because I can smell the hydrogen sulfide at the bottom of the lake during the anaerobic period. And in the process of adding copper sulfate, you're not actually binding phosphorus and taking care of the problem. You're just adding sulfate and killing the phytoplankton. So I don't think that it's directly comparable to accuse alum sulfate as being detrimental when it takes care of the phosphorus problem, despite adding additional sulfate. So yes, there is that concern. And that's why polyaluminum chloride is used in some cases to avoid that.
Mm.
Melinda asked for how long or how many years have the alum treatments been used. Um, Alum treatments have been used for over 40 years, like 50 years at this point. Some of the first in-lake alum treatments were in the 70s and 80s, very successful ones. There were some early treatments that were not able to maintain the pH well enough, and they had, like in the late 1990s and early 2000s, a couple cases where they didn't use enough of the buffering pH solution and didn't monitor it, and there was a fish kill. So there's always this like inherent risk of, if you don't maintain the pH, that could potentially happen. I think it's less likely for farm pond with the technologies that have progressed, because at this point the applicators have done very large treatments on lots of lakes in New England, and they have it down to a pretty good science at this point.
So the second part is is anyone worried about unintended consequences? Like in 150 years, we find out something terrible comes out of this?
So nobody's going down to the bottom of the lake and like in, I don't know, covering themselves in lake sediment, right? Like if you did, you'd probably run a problem with like mercury exposure as opposed to aluminum exposure at that point. And so I don't know. Yes, aluminum can become toxic as accumulated over time in certain situations based on the pH. But all of the treatments that have been done and for the last 50 years, there's been very few negative long-term consequences in most cases.
But even like, not to keep pressing, but I mean, I'm even thinking of like, little microbes, like things I can't even see, the like plant life, zooplankton, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, it's possible. I'm not going to discount that, but if it gives you 20 to 30 years of control, um, is it worth it to proceed with a slight inherent risk of the scientific unknown? Daryl raised your hand again.
A few years ago, I read about floating wetlands and as a way to extract excess nutrients in another way. So I guess they're harvestable, or the concept is that they would be harvestable so that they're continually removing nutrients. And I gather that there's a test floating wetlands on the Charles River, kind of near the Museum of Science in Boston. And I haven't gotten around to reading up on that, but does that offer anything potential for us?
So the problem with that is that those floating wetlands work best in environments with extremely high surface concentrations of nutrients. They're better at taking up luxury nitrogen than phosphorus. And you're right that in order to fully remove accumulated mass of nutrients, you need to subject them to periodic cuttings and removing that and putting it back on shore. Um, in most of the case studies that I've reviewed, in terms of the cost, it's just per unit of phosphorus, per pound of phosphorus, per pound of nitrogen removed, way more costly. And the ability of those floating wetlands to reduce and remove nutrients goes down with lower surface concentrations to begin with.
That makes sense.
Like in an outfall for a wastewater treatment plant, they would be wonderful. But in farm pond, much less useful.
If such things were positioned close to the shore, the water is shallow, would that be better?
You mean if they're positioned closer to an outfall area? Yeah, that would be a place that you could put one.
Shallow water so that maybe the roots would be reaching down closer to where the issues are, or not. I don't know.
Well, so the problem is that the majority of the nutrients from the internal load are coming from sediments deeper than 15 to 20 feet.
Oh, okay.
Michael, you have your hand up again?
a comment for the broader audience here of where we're looking to do some stormwater management at Farm Pond Beach. And one of the issues that came up even under their filing of for a permit, that DEP noticed the depth, the structures and the difference between whether they be in groundwater. And I guess this highlights the fact that if I got it right, we really want to make sure that any of our stormwater runoff gets into the soil with enough distance between the bottom and the groundwater so that the soils can, whether it's absorb the phosphorus, if I understand right, that we really need to pay much more attention to that place since they do get a little bit of a flow there. And I guess the outflow, as you pointed out, along Lake Street. We put in something that at the time, 20 years ago, was considered innovative with a little rain garden and this and that didn't last, but we still have an outflow that goes into the pond there, which I guess we should try to find a way to undo, I guess, and find some ways to just have enough of an infiltration chambers.
Yeah, so in terms of stormwater management, you have to work with the land and the water conditions at your site. So in situations where it's not possible to infiltrate it, maintaining a area that can contain a certain amount of runoff from a certain amount of rainfall is better to allow for settling and plant uptake, and then it'll overflow. So a lot of those, what we call either rain gardens or wet detention basins, are going to accumulate a certain amount of the storms. They're not necessarily going to do any good for a rainstorm that's greater than 1.5 inches, but if you have less than 1.5 inches and it's designed for 1.5 inches of the area that it's draining, then that is better than nothing. Even if it's not possible to infiltrate it right there.
Yeah, no, I think we maybe need to intercept some of the flows earlier before it gets down to that
Exactly.
point there. And
Disconnecting it higher in the watershed is always the way to go.
right, we had a rain garden across the street, but that turned out to not function in any way. But yeah, so we need to redo that there because there's a lot of water that comes down both from driveways as well as the street there. And I guess it's a interesting issue for any driveways that are not on the lake, on the pond, that they should have some sort of stormwater capture at the base so it infiltrates there rather than running into the road and
trench drains are really good for that. Or if there's a pitch to the actual driveway, you can do like a little rain garden off to the side too.
Yeah, no, we're gonna have to see whether that's something you can move forward on. And you got to get the trench drains right because we got it wrong at the boat ramp the first time. The water just ran over it. And that's still, but whatever, live and learn. Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Sophie, you have your hand up?
Just a quick question about the for the alum treatment. We have a shallow well that's right next to the pond, and I was wondering, is there any risk that the alum could end up in our drinking water? Has that been studied for around?
Not that I'm aware of, but I'm fairly certain that alum is used in drinking water reservoirs occasionally as well. And so I don't think it would be a problem.
But that would be pre-treatment. If they're doing it in a reservoir, that's probably prior to the treatment.
Yeah, that's
facility true. Where unlike here, where we don't have a treatment facility unless you put in an in-house system.
Yeah, but when you think about the way that the hydroxide forms during the hydrolysis reaction, it's fairly large and flocky and fluffy, and it's just gonna like settle to the bottom. Like you'll be able to see it in the water. And it's not gonna migrate into the groundwater. It's like targeting the deep water sediments.
Good. Well, yeah, that's good to hear. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you guys. I really, and this is good feedback. Thank you so much for being engaged and asking questions. It definitely helps me sort of like hear your concerns and understanding of things to maybe sort of change some of the recommendations or the way I phrase things moving forward.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Hillary.
Thank
All
you.
right.
That's
Thanks,
amazing.
everybody.
Hillary.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Hillary.
Good night. I'll follow up soon,
So there'll be a report with all this stuff coming out.
very
Is
soon.
it a
Yep.
final report or a draft or how?
It will be a public comment draft.
Okay, fine. So we all have to read that carefully, especially for the whole idea of whether we promote an experiment. Speaking to the rest of the people here, whether we want to promote a 3-year experiment of this to learn a lot more, and
Yep.
that it's probably my inclination without reading it is that it's something that the town should invest in, given the value of this resource, because of the information it would give us for going forward, besides helping with the current problem, since we're sort of on the edge, but not that on the edge. But yeah, no, to me, it makes sense that we do something to learn more and help cure it. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank
If
you.
there's no more questions,
you.
I'll have a good
Thanks
night.
a lot. Have a
you.
good
Bye.
night.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.